Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our live show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Today I'm talking to Mohammed A. Salih, a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and researcher and analyst of Kurdish affairs. Thanks for joining us, Mohammed.
Thank you so much for having me, Diego. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, and I should note you do your own podcast called Geospaces on the New Region website, right?
Right, Geospace, yes.
Yeah, much appreciate listening to your commentary there for following Kurdish issues. And we're going to do that today with a focus on Syria and the PKK and Turkey. Basically, we're going to try and understand how recent developments in Syria could impact the Turkey-PKK peace process and the broader region. It seems like anything is possible after the Israel-Iran war, regime change in Syria, the war in Gaza, and other regional developments. And in these unpredictable times, the ruling coalition in Ankara has sought to negotiate with the jailed PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan and reach an agreement that would see the PKK disband and disarm, addressing a top security concern in Turkey for more than 4 decades. Notably, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which we'll say SDF from now on, is directly a part of this peace process. Is not directly a part of this peace process. SDF is not a part of this peace process, despite its ideological links to the PKK. SDF members have said that Turkey-PKK talks don't apply to them, and this is a critical issue because Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa has been slow to bring armed groups under central control since taking power in December. The concept of control is a big question mark after clashes last month between Bedouin and Druze groups left more than 1,400 dead in South Syria. And the instability continued this weekend with new clashes between Druze groups and government-affiliated forces. And the SDF also reported mortar attacks last night. So we've got a lot to cover, recent developments included. And before we start, let me say this is a live recording. People listening to us are welcome to send questions. We aim to talk about 45 minutes to an hour. And since we're talking about the peace process, let me share my usual disclosure and remind listeners that my wife is an MP in Turkey with the pro-Kurdish Dem Party. So, Mohammed, to start, what's the latest news from both the north and south of Syria, where we saw clashes this weekend? Is this something that's been happening on a regular basis? Is this something we expected, or is this something new?
Well, thank you so much for having me on this podcast again, Diego. And with regard to the situation on the ground in Syria, we have had clashes for the past couple of days in the north, in the basically contact lines between the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, and the military units of the new Syrian military. In particular, those which are known of, having close connection with Turkey. The clashes have been going on mostly in the, in North Aleppo area around the town of Manbij. But there hasn't been any sort of territorial breakthroughs. It has been basically an exchange of fire on both sides. We have also had clashes, as you said, over the weekend in the south, in the Druze majority province of Suwayda, in southwest of Syria. Today, it doesn't seem there has been any sort of fighting in that region. And there was a call by the, U.S. envoy to Syria, Ambassador Tom Barrack, today, calling for dialogue and for the continuation of the ceasefire, and basically saying that the issues between Damascus and Suwayda and the Druze in general have to be resolved through dialogue and peaceful means, and not fighting and conflict.
Mm-hmm. So waiting to see what happens next, basically. And a lot of this relates to the March 10th agreement between Sharaa and Mazlum Abdi, the SDF commander, because apparently they agreed back then to integrate the forces and different government functions. but it's been a slow time coming, or there's been negotiations that aren't so transparent. We don't know much of what's happening. Can you talk about what we do know and where SDF Damascus relations stand? Because the last news I saw was that they were supposed to meet in Paris, and that got postponed last month.
Right. So that agreement that was signed on March 10th this year was, a general agreement, really. It didn't get into the details and the nitty gritty of what should be done, and left a lot of details for, so-called technical committees to basically determine later. And that is where the process seems to have slowed down. There were some initial positive developments following that agreement, such as a prisoner exchange in Aleppo province in particular, and the relaxing of the siege, so to speak, on the Kurdish neighborhoods of Aleppo that were under the control of the People's Protection Units, or the YPG, in that region. And we have also seen, several rounds of negotiations ever since between various, SDF and the civilian administration in northeast Syria, and or Rojava, which is linked to the SDF, with the government in Damascus. But there hasn't been really any, signs of of progress with regard to critical issues. Number one, how the SDF units will be integrated into the new Syrian military. So, on the question of integration itself, there is no disagreement that there has to be some sort of, integration of these SDF forces into the new Syrian military. We have seen that already happen with regard to some of the other former rebel factions in Syria, which have been integrated as blocks, as whole blocks, into the new army. We have even seen that with regard to the foreign jihadis, foreign fighters who came to Syria to, engage in jihad, and even they have been normalized and accepted as part of the Syrian military. Despite the really highly questionable record, if not outright negative record, of these groups, whether before the overthrow of Assad or after the overthrow of Assad, in the case of Suwayda, and the massacre of civilians that happened there, and before that in March in the Alawite majority coastal region of Syria. So there seems to be some degree of reluctance on the part of Damascus for the SDF to be integrated as a whole block into the new Syrian army with its current command structure, command and control structure. A lot of it also really depends on the U.S. position. What we have seen from the U.S. is, a vague, let's call it that way, stance. At some point, it seemed that the U.S. was not against the SDF being integrated in a way that also satisfied the SDF. But what we have seen in the recent weeks with Ambassador Barak, who manages, U.S. policy in Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon, which is in and of itself a, interesting development in how U.S. Foreign policy establishment and the State Department would work. But, Ambassador Barak made some statements in July that came to be perceived or understood by, multiple audiences, whether Damascus, the Kurds, and others who were watching Syria, that the U.S. wants, this integration to happen on Damascus's terms, and that was somehow siding with Damascus. That, needless to say, generated a lot of concern, within the SDF and the broader, Kurdish community in Syria, which is, where the political landscape is quite diverse and there are other important forces. And so, Kurds have come to be worried about whether the U.S. is now really, coming out on the side of Damascus against them. That seemed to be the perception, whether correct or not, until the violence that occurred in Suwayda, the Druze majority province in southern Syria, a couple of weeks ago, which seemed to have been, some sort of a reality check on the policy that Ambassador Barak and the U.S. government was advocating in Syria for re-centralization under the control of Damascus, both in administrative and military terms. The intervention of Israel on the side of the Druze and the blow that was delivered to the Syrian military and the tribal mobilization that went to take over Suwayda and failed. All of that, seemed to have served as some sort of a reality check and a reminder of the fact that the reality of Syria is a lot more complicated and complex than some actors might hope for or wish, and that pushing for centralization in the manner that was being advocated for the prior few weeks might actually encourage eruption of violence in ways that might challenge the integrity of the Syrian state, which is not something that Damascus wants, or the U.S. wants, or Turkey wants, or a lot of the countries in the region want, and probably not something that most Syrians want. And here, is the problem where we have a very unfair conflation of the notion of decentralization with the dismantlement of the state. A lot of people are sort of, advancing this strawman type of argument that it's either centralization or the breakup of the state, which is really false, both on a theoretical level and also on a, practical level, because there are a range of other options in between the two. These are two very extreme options at the extreme ends of this spectrum of possible choices and scenarios. So I think what we are seeing, especially after Suwayda, is some sort of a realization that strong insistence on the question of centralization in a way that was reminiscent of pre-December 2024 order in Syria, that sort of insistence on realization might not work, might be counterproductive, and might actually defeat its purpose by leading to an outcome where the state might, come to be fragmented in a more or less permanent way in the future.
Yeah, and to comment on the decentralization, Barak also said that he was against federalism and different groups, right? So there's not who would support decentralization in Syria. Here in Turkey, often they say Israel is the one that wants a weak state. Do you agree with that assessment of Israel?
Yeah, I believe that, for very obvious historical reasons, the fact that Syria as a state, at least up until 1973, was one of the leading states, Arab states, in basically calling for war with Israel and participating in those wars. So all of that has definitely created, this sense in Israel that, by virtue of Israel and Syria also having a common border. Syria is not like Iraq. Iraq is not a neighbor of Israel. So, but, if you want to classify and categorize regional countries in terms of the degree of problem and challenge that they pose to Israel, Syria would be a problem of the first order, because it's a quite sizable country with a shared border with Israel, shared border with Lebanon, which also neighbors Israel, and Jordan, and so all of this creates this sense of anxiety among Israeli policymakers. You could, of course, debate, to what extent those anxieties are justified, or the threat perception of Syria, to what extent it is, realistic or not. But Israel also seems to have, this sort of longer range view of Syria. Today, Syria is a weak state. It might not pose any significant threat toward Israel, but policymakers in Israel are probably thinking about a stable Syria in the future that will regain its military strength, is integrated into the regional and global system. They might be worried about that scenario. Again, you can debate whether that perception of a Syrian threat in the future is still, valid, and to what extent it might or might not be. But that perception is for sure there in Israel, and it seems to be the key driving factor of Israeli attitude towards Syria at the moment. We have also to take into consideration that the change that we have had after December has basically brought a group or an elite with a jihadi past in Al Qaeda. And in the Islamic State in Iraq, where Ahmed Sharaa, the current president, was a important member of. He was back then known as Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. And so, this really sort of heightens the sense of, you know, s- danger or threat that Syria might pose to Israel, again, from the perspective of Israeli leaders and policymakers. So all of that creates an interest among Israelis to keep Syria as a decentralized and not so strong, state, as a weak state. On the other side, Turkey definitely has an interest in a re-centralized Syria, but I don't think that also would mean or amount to Turkey wanting to see a really strong Syrian state in place, because of all the historical background between Turkey and Syria in the post-Ottoman era, and also the tensions between various Arab populations and the Ottoman Empire, in particular from 19th century onwards. So I don't think, that framing this whole regional situation also as Israel wanting or Iran also wanting a weak Syrian state, but Turkey wanting a strong Syrian state is necessarily true. I think there's the variation in terms of their desire for a weak or a strong state. I don't think, Turkey would perceive a Syria which is on its feet, economically strong, militarily strong, as necessarily being a very good thing. Because, one thing that we have seen in particular in such a tumultuous region as the Middle East is that the tides tend to turn quite fast and unexpectedly very often. And so if Syria is a really strong state in military and economic and diplomatic terms, it is more inclined to be part of the Arab milieu, not some sort of a Turkish satellite state, even though the Turks might actually want that, right? So the reality within of Syria within this broader geopolitical context is really, again, a lot more complicated, and wanting to see or frame things in general and broad terms can be very often more misleading than helpful in terms of trying to understand the reality on the ground. To self-promote a little bit, I recently wrote a detailed and analytical piece for New Lines Institute on Syria and the regional geopolitical rivalries over Syria, with Israel, Turkey, and Iran being the key actors that have an interest in Syria, and not just a commercial interest as the Gulf might have. They are also an important actor with a very serious interest, but Iran, Turkey, and Israel, just because of the recent history, at least since 2011, have a much more pronounced and a stronger interest in Syria. And so Syria is really a site of rivalry between these different regional actors. And, if anyone would like to maybe delve into those details a little bit more, I would suggest people, read up that piece as well.
I was actually going to talk about your last commentary for New Region, where you write about the Suwayda attacks and what they mean for other minority communities in Syria, because basically you're saying it shows that there's no safety for different groups. Let's say there's a tendency towards violence erupting at any moment, and whatever confidence Syrian minority communities had, it's been further eroded after last month's clashes. So I want to ask, since those Druze militia clashes happened last month, and also the Alawite community clashes in March, how do you see Kurdish groups in northeast Syria? What's the view from the Kurdish perspective? Does that mean that there's reasons to hold on to arms if there's continued instability?
Absolutely. The answer to that definitely is yes, because in its push for re-centralizing power under Damascus's control, what the Ahmed Shara's administration government has done, and whoever was backing them outside of Syria, is that they have achieved the exact opposite purpose. Because at the level of rhetoric and discourse, they were focused on portraying an image of a new Syria for everyone, where Syrian diversity is acknowledged to some extent, even not really, as strongly and forcefully as the minorities would have wished. But Sharaa, tried to deliver certain messages over the past 8 or 9 months, trying to reassure non-Sunni Arab communities that they will have a place in the future of Syria. Now, what, the forces under his command and the, various types of popular mobilizations that we have seen by individuals, to support his government, who might not be necessarily part of the official military and security structure. What these forces have done, the government and non-government pro-Sharia forces have done, is reinforce all concerns and anxieties and fears that the minorities have about a Syria under the control of Ahmad Shara and his partners and friends from the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And none of this had been reassuring. Quite to the contrary, the only belief that it has helped generate among the Kurds is that if you don't have the guns to protect yourself, you are going to end up like the Alawites and the Druze, and you will be massacred. So, this gap between the rhetoric, even though, again, the rhetoric was not really as inclusive, as strongly inclusive as it could have been. But the gap between that rhetoric, nevertheless, and the reality of what has happened on the ground has only helped to reinforce, the fact to the Kurds and to other minorities as well, that if you don't have self-defense capabilities, you will be at the mercy of these forces, whereby the government either actually condones these kind of massacres to teach a lesson, by terrorizing these minorities and basically force them into submission and capitulation. Or even if it doesn't have that sort of intent, it doesn't have the capacity to control its own forces, forces in the Syrian military uniform, of which we have seen numerous videos, both in Suwayda and in Alawite regions, of massacres engaging and happily filming themselves actually doing that. It's not like someone was secretly filming these individuals. They film it themselves and they broadcast it to the world. And so, whether we look at it through the question of intent or capacity, there is a failure in both respects on the part of the Syrian government. And so, unless the Syrian government actually, manages to organize the forces under its control in a way that they would not violate certain rules of warfare and conflict, and prevents this kind of wild, popular tribal mobilizations, it will not be in a position to gain the trust of minority communities, even in a very relative way.
Yeah, and regarding the clashes last night between SDF and Damascus affiliated forces, it seems like the SDF was trying to de escalate by saying that they were undisciplined groups throwing mortars at them. So, not directly blaming Damascus. There is still this kind of work towards finding harmony. I don't know what other word to use, basically, not war. Uh, and I'm wondering if we have this condition where Kurds in the Northeast are incentivized to hold on to their guns, right? And we have a Turkey peace process happening with the PKK, and at the same time, right, you have one part of PKK ideology, right? I mean, SDF also has Öcalan flags in their offices, right? They stem from the similar Kurdish rights movement. Uh, what happens there? Because it seems here in Ankara, there's a lot of chatter, right, about potential disruption to the peace process. It's very fragile. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. And recently, I had a diplomat tell me, the peace process is not going to work, right? And he said it's going to collapse in Syria, and everything's going to have a domino effect up to Turkey. Because his argument was that multiple groups, international diplomats, are signaling to Sharaa that he can do what he wants with minorities. Basically, the priority on the international stage is stability. And I think also in your most recent podcast with Joshua Landis, which I listened to this morning, he also said that people favor a leader, and there's not necessarily an alternative to Sharaa right now, right? So not having him in power, doing the things that he's doing, and maybe not reining in certain groups at certain times, maybe not having him there could lead to more instability. So I know there's a lot to talk about there, but what do you think? Could this violence in Syria have negative implications for the Turkey PKK peace process?
I would say quite likely so, yes, because both processes in Turkey and in Syria are intertwined when it comes to the Kurds in both countries. Let's remember that until the launch of this new round of negotiations between the PKK and the Kurdish movement more broadly in Turkey, and the Turkish government, we had daily clashes between the SDF and pro-Turkish, Syrian National Army before it was integrated into the Syrian, military after the fall of Assad regime. So the moment we saw that process in Turkey actually gain a steam, it was when we had this breakthrough in Syria as well, in terms of the the relationship between the SDF and the pro-Turkish groups in particular, but also the SDF and the Damascus government under Ahmed Shara's leadership. So I think, imagining a scenario where the talks in Syria between the SDF and the Damascus government break down, and that breakdown of talks having a negative impact or repercussions for the process in Turkey is not really, unreasonable, given that Turkey is also the major foreign backer of this government in Syria. And it has a very keen interest in this government and in new post-Assad Syria to stabilize. And even though, it has signaled that it is fine with some sort of, rights being granted to the Kurds, but it's very cautious and opposes, any sort of a status for the Kurds that would, for example, near anything that the Kurds in Iraq have. So, this mismatch between what Damascus wants or is ready to give to the Kurds and what Kurds want for themselves in the new Syria might very well actually, lead to the collapse of the negotiations. That is definitely one of the scenarios, and it has a quite significant degree of likelihood of happening. So yes, if the question is whether any breakdown, or on the other hand also any major breakthrough and progress between Kurds in Syria and the government in Damascus having some sort of repercussions for the process that we are seeing in Syria, in Turkey, that is definitely reasonable. But I think that the whole insistence of the international community on the question of stability and thinking that Ahmed al-Sharaa is going to bring about that sort of a stability, and that if the price to pay for that is some major suppression of minority rights, violent crackdown on minority communities and massacres, if they think that kind of price is somehow okay to pay for stability. I think, again, just as we saw in the case of the Druze in Suwayda a couple of weeks ago, that will defeat the purpose, because, Syria, the fate of Syria, the future of Syria really hinges on a very extremely delicate balance. And, this flirtation with this notion of a unitary centralized state is not going to work um, unless it goes through really a river of blood. And if it does, there is no guarantee that the Damascus government will come out as a winner on the other side, because there are other powerful regional states, Israel, Iran, pro-Iran militias in Iraq, that have an interest in not allowing a strong government which is backed by Turkey to emerge in Syria. And so, that might be really a very dangerous gambit or gamble on the part of Damascus and, any international actor that might think that is a good idea to pursue.
Yeah, we recently talked, and you were saying that if the SDF does come under attack, there could be Shia militias in Iraq or Iran-backed groups in Iraq that would potentially support the SDF against whatever threats they're facing. Do you still support that conclusion or that argument?
Yeah, I definitely think that can be very much one of the possible scenario that we will see that will unfold, because Iran is really very unhappy with the change that we have seen in Syria, with change in the regional balance of power since October 7th, which has been completely against its interests and its role in the region. And if you look also at the map of Syria and the concentration of different minority communities in Syria, Iran does not have a direct reach to the Alawites, which are on the western side of Syria. No physical access to the Alawites, which would be the preferred community that Iran would support by virtue of its support for Assad, but also, the religious proximity and closeness between the Shia and the Alawites. It doesn't also have any direct physical, territorial, contact with the Druze in Suwayda, because the Sunni Arab areas basically cut off Iraq from Suwayda. So the only part of Syria where there is a serious military actor, you could, possibly even argue that the SDF is the most powerful army that today exists in Syria, both, in terms of numbers, but also in terms of its military capabilities, in terms of the degree of discipline that it has shown. And, the thing is that the Kurdish part of Syria at least the Jazeera part of it in the Hasaka province, and Deir ez-Zor, which is under the SDF's control, even though it is Arab majority. All these areas neighbor Iraq. And on the Iraqi side, the Shia-dominated Popular Mobilization Force, the PMF, which are officially part of Iraq's military security complex, they are deployed all along this border. And these groups, want to influence the course of events inside Syria. And so, this physical contact that they have with the SDF controlled areas would allow them to actually provide some sort of military support for the SDF in the event of a, direct confrontation, large scale confrontation between the SDF forces and the Damascus forces, or even the Turkish military if Turkey decides to intervene militarily. So all of this really also goes to show that the reality of Syria might not necessarily go the way that Turkey wishes. And Turkey is not in a position to be the sole influencer inside Syria. And, there are various other actors, domestic and regional, that have an interest in trying to shape this future. And they have, interest in supporting various minority communities inside Syria. That doesn't mean, of course, that the minority causes in Syria are proxies, basically causes manufactured by these regional actors, be it Iran or Israel, right? These have long-standing historical roots. The Druze, for example, had stayed under the French mandate for a number of years. So did the Alawites, and the Kurds have had a basically political movement pursuing some form of autonomy or independence ever since late Ottoman times. Which makes it almost a century and a half long. But there is this alignment of interest between domestic and regional actors, and that is where trying to overachieve might actually overturn this very delicate regional upset, this very delicate domestic balance, which is also tied to a regional balance in Syria. And so assuming that Sharaa with support from Ankara and some form of support from the US and Europe can achieve what he wants, it might not be a very realistic idea.
Mhm. Yeah. The other argument that we often hear in Ankara is that the U.S. is controlling most of the peace negotiations and the Sharaa government. But I don't know how much credibility there is in that. That's the common saying for a lot of developments in the region. I wanted to ask, since you're based in the U.S., what is the view from Washington, from what you understand about the peace process and Syria in general? I imagine that U.S. lawmakers are very focused on Israel, Gaza, Iran, Ukraine. Is this on the radar, Syria and the PKK peace process? Do you hear discussions or lawmakers prioritizing it?
You are absolutely right. When it comes to foreign policy and foreign relations, the bulk of that bandwidth is really occupied with Russia, Ukraine, Palestinians, and Israel over Gaza situation. So, there is, and also Iran, right? So there is admittedly a very, sort of a narrow and limited capacity that is dedicated to what is going on in Syria. But Syria is really critical to the future of the region and the new regional order that the U.S. Wants to see, take shape and basically, stabilize across the region. Syria is where, a number of core interests come to converge and also could potentially diverge: the Gulf, Turkey, and Israel. And these three countries or blocs, given that the Gulf is a number of countries, the Saudis, the UAE, and Qatar is at the main actors. The problem is, that there is a misalignment of interests and objectives between these three, U.S. allies in the region. And so, Syria is where all of this comes into play. If there's an agreement among these three actors or a set of actors, the Gulf, Israel, and Turkey over Syria, we will see this American, promoted and favored new order to really take form and continue to exist at least for a while. And I recently wrote a piece about this, that the US is kind of advocating this tri-pillar new order on the region, with each of these actors being one pillar of it. But, the problem, at least in terms of US policies, it has been seeking to disengage from the Middle East for the, last decade in particular, but even longer than that, since the late, at least early 2010s. It wants to focus its energy and resources on its global competition with China. It doesn't want to be bogged down in the Middle East. Middle East really, doesn't bring up any good memories or feelings among the U.S. policymakers, right? And what we are seeing with the current administration is that there isn't really also a monolithic view toward the region or toward Syria itself as well. Even though, the circle around President Trump himself, of which Ambassador Barak is definitely, a member, prefers to delegate the task of stabilizing Syria to its regional partners, Turkey and Gulf in this case. There are other actors within the administration, especially, in the Congress, who are not so happy with the direction of events in Syria, and have signaled this, basically displeasure with the current course of events, in, more or less explicit or implicit ways, but it is quite detectable for people who follow, U.S. policy closely. And so, we will see these disagreements to continue, in particular over the fate of minorities in Syria, and also the place of Israel in the region. We all know that Israel has a lot of powerful allies, both in the Congress, in the administration, and in the broader, political scene in the U.S. And so, all of this will mean that we will be seeing these antagonisms and struggles to play out both on the ground in the region and also in Washington or, other Western capitals. So, trying to call out this game one way or another as having been determined in advance in favor of one actor, again, is going to be counterproductive.
Yeah, to focus more on Iraq, it seems like a lot of serious developments are happening there because you have Turkey negotiating with both Baghdad and Erbil during this peace negotiation with PKK. And you see different developments like Turkey ending its oil imports from the KRG, from Erbil, basically. Turkey's been importing oil since 2014, and then that was paused because of legal disputes in 2023. And now it seems like it's going to be paused indefinitely. Is this related to the peace process as well, this kind of negotiation with the different leaderships in Iraq?
I would say not so much. It is more related to the role that Turkey wants to carve out for itself in Iraq's future. So the Turkish government announced that they are going to, they are not going to renew the agreement that was in place since 1973 and renewed again in 2010 for the export of Iraqi oil via Kirkuk Ceyhan pipeline that basically delivers the Iraqi oil in the north to the Mediterranean coast. And the reason for that is, because Turkey believes that now it is in a position where it can dictate better terms basically have a new agreement where Turkey, thinks can gain more out of it. And it's also because Iraq is very, in a way, helplessly dependent on Turkey. In particular, when it comes to water, which is a very, huge issue in Iraq, given that Iraq was called by, one of the UN agencies. I don't remember the name exactly, but they produced a report a few years ago that said Iraq was one of the 5 most vulnerable countries to climate change. We have already seen that in the southern parts of Iraq, where lack of water has really forced, ruined a lot of communities and has forced populations to migrate because there isn't sufficient water anymore in some of those areas. And so this problem is going to only deteriorate more and more over time. And the source of the main 2, rivers in Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates, both come from Turkey. Euphrates goes through Syria for, part of that distance as well, but the core source of both is in Turkey. And so that really gives Turkey, a major leverage over Iraq. And they're also very unhappy in terms of how Iraq treated them over the KRG oil export issues, and Iraq, taking this issue to the International Court of Arbitration in the International Chamber of Commerce in Syria, in Paris. And, that court issuing a ruling that basically has Turkey pay $1.5 billion in fines to Iraq. There's this sense of superiority over, among Turkish leaders and policymakers over Iraq, and you can definitely say that over Syria as well. Where there's sort of this old Ottoman notion of Turkey being the big brother, if not the ruler, as with the case in the Ottoman times, and Iraq and Syria somehow having to, accept this relationship. And so they were, at some level also politically and personally just hurt by Iraq having the audacity of taking this matter to an international court and stopping those exports via Jehan, and even worse, having the court issue a ruling that requires Turkey to pay a fine. So, all of that would heighten the tensions between Iraq and Turkey going forward. Turkey had the major leverage here, again, being water, and also by now being militarily deployed in significant parts of Iraqi Kurdistan, and Turkey also being supportive of the Sunni Arab, forces in the country. And if you put all of that also in the context of the recent regional shifts and the geopolitical, balance of power, where Iran and by extension Iraq, which has been in that same orbit of, of Iran for the past couple of decades or so, the Shia elites who basically control decision making in Baghdad, are very basically, anxious. They have this very serious anxiety and sense of panic ever since, especially the fall of the Assad regime, that the regional tide is not basically running in their favor. And they feel a lot of pressure, and they see Turkey as playing, some sort of a nefarious game in the removal of Assad and weakening the Shia-led front. And so all of this really plays out into this relationship.
Yeah, there's different reports that have been coming out about Turkey and Iran competing for superiority in Iraq, and competing over who's going to lead regional developments through Iraq. I wanted to ask because at the same time, Iraq will be overseeing a lot of the disarmament of the PKK, and there's been a lot of diplomatic visits between Baghdad and Ankara. Do you have any information on how disarmament might happen in Iraq? Because I haven't seen too much.
Yeah, well, it's a very vague process, really, for all sorts of reasons. What we saw, happen in terms of the PKK guerrillas burning their weapons was more of a symbolic move, really, than, the PKK handing over all its weaponry. It was a bunch of AK-47s that were, burned, and that is an insignificant amount of weaponry that the PKK has in its control. But it was a gesture of goodwill and good faith, to continue with this negotiation process. I don't think we are going to see any important results until the Kurdish movement in Turkey with all its different poles and centers, right? From Öcalan to, the DAM party, to the civil society, to the PKK in Kandil, all of these being somehow reassured by measures and steps taken in Ankara for, some sort of a legal framework. And until that happens, I don't think we will see any sort of major disarmament of the PKK. I personally believe that even if all of that happened, we will not most likely see the entirety of the PKK, system in the Kandil Mountains disarm. There is a good chance that those, who are from Iran and work on, are concerned with Iranian Kurdistan, Iranian Kurdish issues, would quite likely retain their weapons. And, given the difficult nature of the topography of the Kandil Mountains, Iraq, or for that matter, any other state is not really in a position to be able to go there and, capture these PKK and PKK affiliated fighters one by one and disarm or neutralize them. If Turkey
Yeah.
could have done that, it would have done that already, right?
Yeah.
And Iran is not in a position like that. But, if as far as it comes to playing some sort of a diplomatic role, Iraq is engaged in that for obvious reasons. The least of which is because this is happening on the territory which is officially part of the Iraqi state. So for Baghdad appearing as detached and uninvolved from that, it just doesn't look good in terms of its claim to sovereignty over its territory. But the key is really in Ankara and the steps that will be taken there. And if those steps are not seen as satisfactory by the PKK, no matter to what extent that perception of satisfactory might be valid, invalid, fair, or unfair, we are not going to see the PKK disarm in a real and meaningful sense.
Yeah, I've seen it described as a zipper, basically one step after another, after another, after another. It's a tit for tat exchange. Do you agree with that? Last question. Do you think it's going to be a step by step between both sides because there's lack of trust, basically?
I think, that expectation of reciprocity is not unreasonable. So, this is something that has been tried, right? You had, this happen, some desire for peace articulated under Turgut Özal, even though it never, evolved or developed into a serious process. But it developed into some sort of a serious process in the 2009 to 2015 period. And so, it is something that has been done in some and shape and form before. There is a rehearsal, and both sides know what is working and what is not working, and what the proper process of moving this forward is. And so that expectation of Ankara reciprocating what the PKK does and the PKK reciprocating what Ankara does is not really unreasonable on both sides. So I would certainly think, that without adequate reciprocity and tit for tat, the process is not going to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll stop there. I won't ask you to guess what happens next because none of us know. And I'll
Right.
say thank you again for joining us. And if you joined late, we've been speaking to Mohammed A. Salih. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a researcher and analyst on Kurdish affairs. You can see his work at the New Region website and many other places. Otherwise, if you missed any part of this, the full recording is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or just go to turkeyrecap.com in a couple hours. I'll post the whole thing there. Otherwise, stay safe and thank you again, Mohammed.
Thank you so much, Diego. It was nice having this conversation with you.
Likewise. See you.
See you. Take care.